Oh, cool. I think that's our customary 5 minutes then. So yes, Bosford, we are skipping or transitioning from Anti-Oedipus to the genealogy of morals today. We're going to focus on the second essay, and yeah, welcome. And we're doing that to supplement what's coming in. Well, we've already seen in chapter 3, but what's about to expound more into like the theater of terror, for instance, during the coming sections, not the coming insurrections. So, with that, we can get started. So I've actually got, and I guess right now we want to agree. I've got a different translation than what I posted, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Do we want to work off the Project Gutenberg so we're all reading the same text, or just deal with translation differences? Oh no, Lou's too German for it, despite the Gutenberg name.
It's the ebooks. You can't access the ebooks.
This is the most ironic thing I've seen all day. Would the HTML work?
Maybe, I think so. It's not Project Gutenberg as a whole that's blocked. Nope, it doesn't. It's the text apparently.
Does the EPUB work for you?
Yeah, sure.
Then I guess we'll just kind of stick off the almighty Project Gutenberg one just to keep it, so at least we're seeing the same words.
What did I miss? I'm currently.
We're about to start reading the second essay, and we're going to work off the Project Gutenberg just to keep it consistent.
Ah.
And so, do we have a volunteer to read the first section, and then we'll move into a discussion, and we'll just kind of work off sort of a close reading format going forward.
I suppose I can read if you want me to.
Now recording.
You're hired.
Okay, so we're starting from a second essay, right? Guilt, bad conscience, and the like.
Correct. Right at the breeding of an animal.
Yeah. The breeding of an animal that can promise is not just that very paradox of a task which nature has set itself in regard to man. Is it not the very problem of man? The fact that this problem has been to a great extent solved must appear all the more phenomenal to one who can estimate at its full value that force of forgetfulness which works in opposition to it. Forgetfulness is no mere inertice, however that's pronounced, as the superficial believe. Rather, it is a power of obstruction, active, and in the strictest sense of the word, positive, a power responsible for the fact that we have lived, experienced, taken into ourselves, no more enters into consciousness during the process of digestion. It might be called psychic absorption, then all the whole manifold process by which our physical nutrition, the so-called incorporation, is carried on. The temporary shutting of the doors and windows of consciousness, the relief from the claimant alarums and excursions with which our subconscious world of servant organs works in mutual cooperation and antagonism. A little quietude, a little tabula rasa of the consciousness, so as to make room again for the new, and above all, for the more noble functions and functionaries. Room for government, foresight, predetermination, for our organism is on an oligarchic model. This is the utility, as I have said, of the active forgetfulness, which is a very sentinel and nurse of psychic order, repose, etiquette, and this shows at once why it is that there can exist no happiness, no gladness, no hope, no pride, no real present without forgetfulness. The man in whom this preventative apparatus is damaged and discarded is to be compared to a dyspeptic, and it is something more than a comparison he can get rid of, nothing. But this very animal who finds it necessary to be forgetful, in whom, in fact, forgetfulness represents a force and a form of robust health, has reared for himself an opposition power, a memory with whose help forgetfulness is, in certain instances, kept in check. In the cases, namely, where promises have to be made, so that it is by no means a mere passive inability to get rid of a once indented impression, not merely the indigestion occasioned by a once pledged word which one cannot dispose of, but an active refusal to get rid of it, a continuing and a wish to continue which has once been willed, an actual memory of the will, so that between the original I will, I shall do, and the actual discharge of the will, its act, we can easily interpose a world of new strange phenomena, circumstances, veritable volitions, without the snapping of this long chain of the will. But what is the underlying hypothesis of all of this? How thoroughly, in order to be able to regulate the future in this way, must man have first learnt to distinguish between necessitated and accidental phenomena, to think causally, to see the distant as present and to anticipate it, to fix with certainty what is the end and what is the means to that end? Above all, to reckon, to have power to calculate. How thoroughly must man have first become calculable, disciplined, necessitated even for himself and his own conception of himself, that like a man entering into a promise, he could not guarantee himself as a future.
Cool, thank you for that. So at the end, one of the questions that stick out to me, kind of working backwards, right, is in some ways it's the conditions, but it's also like what's coming together to serve to make man, or rather people. One, how does memory play into that, right? And how does that relate to promising and forgetfulness, so that people become calculating, disciplined, and distinguish between what is necessary and what is incidental or accidental.
I mean, I guess I'm seeing like multiple different readings here, right? With well, specifically the thing that I care most about here is forgetfulness, right? It says that there's no hope, no pride, no real present without forgetfulness, and it's an active forgetfulness. So it's like a thing we're casting something away in order to make the present, right? In the and he says like a little tabula rasa of the consciousness, and so I see this both in a negative and a positive way, right? In the negative way, it's like kind of fascist, right? It's kind of totalizing that we throw away the old norms in order to make room now for the new dominant model, the new present, right? But also that there can't be a movement of ages, of a time period without this forgetfulness as well, because otherwise it would be seen as an extension of the last order.
Yeah, I could
Uh,
definitely. Uh,
I think it comes with like a negative backswing as well, right? Because we get ourselves in this position where we pretend that things have become universals, right? That they don't have a place where they initially came from, that they don't have an origin somewhere um, within a certain set of conditions that allowed them to arise in the first place. And so we take certain things to be, oh, this is just the way that it's understood. So I guess I would think of like the Renaissance period or the early modern period where people believed everything was like archetypal, right? Like when you got sick, it was because you were in like the region of the sickness. It wasn't because the sickness was in you, right? There was no like germ theory, and this was something that pervaded everything, like from religion to medicine, because at some point it was just accepted that that was the way the world worked, and people forgot, that people like the Greeks or whatever, came up with these ideas at some point.
So I don't think it's obvious that the reading of this needs to be restricted to historical time, and that it isn't also specifically about just lived time. I know that in the second of the untimely meditations, which is also about history, but Nietzsche also starts there with a similar point about 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 thinking, about reflection, and how action requires a remaining a stopping to stop the reflection, to jump into the moment and actually do, rather than remove yourself from the present by delving into the past. And I think it's clear that Nietzsche thinks historical time and like lived time in a very connected way. And I think we have a similar motive here when he talks about how man needs to make themselves calculable, what's disciplined, necessitated. I think the process of becoming that is here in this section definitely the historical scale, but the effect, the being calculable and disciplined and being forgetful and having memory also works on like the lived scale. Does that make sense?
I definitely agree. Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. And I actually think that he's sort of being, he's not thinking this becoming calculable, disciplined, necessitated is a good thing, right? He's complaining about it.
I'm not sure he's completely complaining about it in the sense that he's saying that it's like just bad. That's at least not like the vibe I got from this. It's just that I think he's like what's the word, suspicious of it maybe, but
I mean,
I'm
there's
not
like
sure.
obviously two sides to here as well, in the same way, because it's not like there isn't something to be gained from being disciplined or necessitated, calculable, but he also, I think he's pointing it out as a type of restriction that we also engage in. like where we see ourselves as a continuation of something that came before, right? It kind of shuts us off from doing certain things.
Right. Connecting this, right? Connecting this with what this whole essay is being and what the first sentence of the section indicates, right? The breeding of an animal that can promise is not this just that very paradox of a task which nature has set itself in regard to man. Like that's in the mission statement here. And what this is getting is obviously that the ability to promise trustworthiness in that sense, right? Reliability. All this is what he's getting at with the calculability and discipline, and he's talking there about the conditions of a society of a society building. In that sense, what he's describing here is also what he makes out to be the difference between man and animal. I think that again in the Untimely Meditations, he has exactly that point again where he describes this being able to reflect on history, to remain in the past and not act, to be a quality of man, as opposed to I think he brings on the cows as a counter example, but just in being a movement of transcendence over animality. I think you can't say that he's completely decrying the whole thing.
No, I don't think that he's either. I think he's just pointing something out, and I see, like I said, the positive and the negative in it. But particularly since you bring up this can promise thing, we almost enter into a double bind, right? I mean, when we say that I am a continuation of this past or whatever, or this thing that happened before, it also then gives us the ability to promise that what happens now will entail something that happens next. And so by making the promise now, we're kind of implicitly entering into a certain type of determinism as well.
I think that's a really good point. I want to add to that. So one of the interesting things to me is how he's explaining forgetfulness, right? So here, I think phys inertia, I think that just means like nominal motion or nominal impulse. My land's not good. But it sounds like what he's getting at here is when he continues, it's a power of obstruction, active and in the simplest sense of the word, positive. A power responsible for the fact that what we have lived, experienced, taken into ourselves, no more enters into consciousness during the process of digestion, it might be called physical absorption, but all the whole manifold process by which our physical nutrition, the so-called incorporation, is carried on. So the interesting thing to me in that sentence, and it kind of gets at what you're getting at in terms of time and the relationship of the past to the present, is that as we're moving into this discussion of memory and activity, forgetfulness works through obstruction, right? So we're talking about forgetfulness not as so much an impulse, but an actual blocking.
Well, Viz, I don't know how to pronounce it, but that word, it means like a thing which cannot act on its own, a thing that does not have its own driving force, right? And so he's saying forgetfulness is not just this thing that does nothing, right? It's not just an absence or whatever. Like it does push something. Like I was speaking of this loss of the promise.
Yeah, and it plays into social construction, right? Because what you and Lou are digging into in terms of calculation, discipline, necessity, right? We're talking about how norms are being created and organized.
Yes. Yeah, by necessity.
So then, what would we say then if the past is being obstructed so as to utilize this present to promise a future? What does this tell us about promising then?
Well, just that it locks us into a certain perspective, right? That's maybe further reaching than we realize.
Yeah, I could see that with the predetermination point, right? So it's kind of ironic that the creation of norms leads to its own to the person almost locking themselves into the predetermination, right? There's kind of a question of autonomy altogether.
Well, and it's also, I mean, he calls it paradoxical as well. He says it's the very paradox of a task which nature has set itself in regard to man. Because in order to uncover this type of, I'm not going to use the word origin, because that's a problem in this context. And there's like 3 different words for origin that he uses. But in order to like uncover this development of social norms or a history, right? We are ourselves engaging in a certain practice of history, right? So it seems almost paradoxical for us to point out the problems with this within itself. But in this same motion, we're kind of seeing the difference, right? Or we're seeing the emergence of a new way of looking at things, whereby we place forgetfulness as like a type of transcendental signified or something like that.
Yeah, I like because that's going to play into basically what enters into the present and therefore the future, and what gets left behind. In a way, it's sort of like a repressed past, but it's like you're saying, it's sort of like that fourth synthesis, right? There's kind of a displacement going on here. So the last thing, at least for me, I want to touch on is so we've got this point about so we've got a lot here in terms of what we're going through in terms of promising, forgetfulness, norm construction, and our own determination there. What do you guys make, and I know this is where you started, Webcam, what do you guys make of this last point about the memory of the will and kind of this actualization?
Which part is that?
I gotcha. The man in whom this preventative apparatus is damaged and discarded is to be compared to a dyspeptic, and as something more than a comparison. He can get rid of nothing. With this very animal who finds it necessary to be forgetful, in whom, in fact, forgetfulness represents a force and a form of robust health, there's your paradox again, has root for himself in opposition power, a memory with whose help forgetfulness is, in certain instances, kept in check. In the cases, namely, where promises have to be made, so that it is by no means a mere passive inability to get rid of a once indented impression, not merely the indigestion occasioned by a once pledged word, which one cannot dispose of, but an active refusal to get rid of it, a continuing and a wish to continue what has once been willed, an actual memory of the will, so that between the original I will, I shall do, and the actual discharge of the will, its act, we can easily interpose a world of new strange phenomena, circumstances, veritable volitions without the snapping of this long chain of the will.
I'm hesitant to say too much because will is such a loaded term for Nietzsche, right? So one part of me wants to say that like this the snapping of this long chain of the will, right? It's like going back to the imposition of the will to power, on orders that have come before, right? Maybe I could use the term episteme here, or epoch, and that's like that's the snapping of this long chain of the will, right? It's like this will that goes back. And he's saying that there's this original I will, there's this will to power that's, there in itself, right? An actual memory of the will, as it were, as opposed to just some thing that extends into the past that we're inheriting. And the use of this will to power, of this movement of difference, right, is what allows us to interpose a new world, right, a new standard of strange phenomena, circumstances, etc.
Yeah, I think that's it, right? You get the establishment of two limits, one through the obstruction and forgetfulness, and then one of possibility through memory. And it's like you're saying, right? That allows us to have this sort of in between where the memory of the will and then action. Basically, that's the space for possibility, right? So in between the obstruction of memory and the in between the obstruction of the obstruction through forgetfulness and the possibility of the will to memory, right? You get the capacity to promise, but also the possibility to create norms like calculation and disciplining.
Do we want to move on to the next section? I suppose I will. Does anybody have the German up?
Yes.
He uses the word origin here. Do you know which?
Herkunft.
Herkunft. Okay, so that's like associated with like race and stuff, right? Like it's like an inheritance. It's kind of like genes or like an inheritance. Oh, well, maybe I should use the term gene, but
it's actually a difficult word, I think, in a sense, but it's more like the place where you personally come from, right? Like
I mean, I can give you what Foucault tried to put it as.
Yeah, a homeland is associated with Herkunft, but Herkunft does not designate like the country in or I have a whole book on that word here standing here.
Yeah. It's definitely a hard one to put into English, and I definitely see that. Foucault says Herkunft is the equivalent of stock or descent. It is the ancient affiliation to a group, sustained by the bonds of blood, tradition, or social class. The analysis of Herkunft often involves a consideration of race or social type, but the traits it attempts to identify are not the exclusive, generic characteristics of an individual, a sentiment, or an idea, which permit us to qualify them as Greek or English. Rather, it seeks the subtle, singular, and sub-individual marks that might possibly intersect in them to form a network that is difficult to unravel. So it's a certain type of almost personal origin. Well, I would be awry to say genetic, right? I mean genetic in the same way that Richard Dawkins thinks memes are the genes of the mind or whatever, right? Like, as opposed to actual genetics.
But looking at this sentence, like, I think origin is actually an apt translation.
Okay.
in this sentence, the origin of responsibility.
I'll read it anyway, and we'll see where we go. This is simply the long history of the origin of responsibility. That task of breeding an animal which can make promises includes, as we have already grasped as its condition and preliminary, the more immediate task of first making man to a certain extent, necessitated, uniform, like among his like, regular, and consequently calculable. The immense work of what I have called morality of custom, the actual work of man on himself during the longest period of the human race. His whole prehistoric work finds its meaning, its great justification, in spite of all its innate hardness, despotism, stupidity, and idiocy, in this fact. Man, with the help of morality of customs and of social strait waistcoats, was made genuinely calculable. If, however, we place ourselves at the end of this colossal process, at the point where the tree finally matures its fruits, when society and its morality of custom finally bring to light that which it was only the means, then do we find as the ripest fruit on its tree the sovereign individual that resembles only himself, that has got loose from the morality of custom, the autonomous, supermoral individual, for autonomous and moral are mutually exclusive terms. In short, the man of the personal, long, and independent will, competent to promise, and we find in him a proud consciousness, vibrating in every fibre, of what has at last achieved and become vivified. Yeah, vivified in him. A genuine consciousness of power and freedom, a feeling of human perfection in general. And this man who has grown to freedom, who is really competent to promise, this lord of the free will, this sovereign, how is it possible for him to not know how great is his superiority over everything incapable of binding itself by promises, or of being its own security? How great is the trust, the awe, the reverence that he awakes of a long unbreakable will? No, I missed that.
The reverence he awaits, he so-called deserves all three.
Yeah. Not to know that with this mastery over himself, he is necessarily also given the mastery over circumstances, over nature, over all creatures with shorter wills. Less reliable characters, the free man, the owner of a long and unbreakable will, finds in his possession his standard of value. Looking out from himself upon the others, he honors or despises, and just as necessarily as he honors his peers, the strong and the reliable, those who can bind themselves by promises, that is, everyone who promises like a sovereign, with difficulty, rarely and slowly, who is sparing with his trust, but confers honor by the very fact of trusting, who gives his word as something that can be relied on, because he knows himself strong enough to keep it even in the teeth of disasters, even in the teeth of fate. So with the equal necessity will he have the heel of his foot ready for the lean and empty jackasses, who promise when they have no business to do so, and his rod of chastisement ready for the liar, who already breaks his word at the very minute when it is on his lips. The proud knowledge of the extraordinary privilege of responsibility, the consciousness of this rare freedom, of this power over himself and over fate, has sunk right down to its innermost depths and has become an instinct, a dominating instinct. Which name will he give to it, to this dominating instinct, if he needs to have a word for it? But there is no doubt about it. The sovereign man calls it his conscience. So I hope I'm not the only one seeing the Humerian influence here. What with his use of the term custom, right? And its morality of custom feels like he's talking about the neo-Kantians and their like reappropriation of Hume's terminology, right? with reference to causality, which is also, I think, very important in what is being talked about here, right? Because Hume obviously didn't think that humans could look at the world and then come to conclusions about causational relationships, right? Because we are imposing them or whatever, because they're not empirical. They're not part of the physical world. They don't constitute a type of knowledge, right? And then Kant went further to say, like, this conceptual schema imposes causality upon the world to make sense of it, and that's necessary for consciousness, right? For the ego, maybe I'll say. And so here I feel like he's making that same distinction, right? He's saying that man at some point was given or granted this audacity to make claims about causality, and kind of like comes, and then he even says like the sovereign man calls it his conscience, right? Like again, like talking about like Kant. And I suppose this is also paradoxical, right? Because there's a beginning of causality.
Yeah,
I
even to. Oh, go ahead, Lou.
I don't know Hume that well, but I'm not sure the custom Hume link works in quite the way you lined out in German,
Well,
because it's Moralität der Sitte, and Sitte would be like Sittlichkeit. It's the opposite of indecency.
can you post the word for me?
So decency, maybe, I don't know. Like the police force that was specifically tasked with like going after what's it called, like prostitution and homosexuality and stuff like that, was shot, called the Sitte in the Kaiserreich.
Right. And that was, and what, when was that?
When that word was used in that way, I need to look up. When did Fontane live? Yeah, about the same time as Nietzsche. Works out.
What's the year?
Like Sitte is it is a good translation to it is a good translation to custom, in the sense that it
Yeah.
is like Gepflogenheit, Gewohnheit, like Gewohnheit, like socially enforced habits, like normative habits, something like that. And it has a very strong implication of moral, like moralische Sitte oder Moralität der Sitte is kind of a double, like it's redundant in a way.
Right.
In a way, morality of custom is not, I think.
So here's a different question then. If you were to translate custom or habit into German, what word would you use first?
Well, habit, I would use Gewohnheit, but that's because habit is way less obviously social.
Right.
It's much more individualized. Custom, I'd probably use a Gepflogenheit. Like Sitte is just a bit
A strange choice.
aged at this point.
He does say morality of custom as well, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, it sounds sort of loaded because if I follow you, Lou, you're saying it implies a certain basically a certain kind of policing, which I suppose kind of fits in what the so-called free man does here. You know?
So if you type Sitte into German Wikipedia and go then to English, it gives mores. I never heard of that word, but maybe it helps.
Yeah, social or moral mores.
I go here specifically because I know Nietzsche went out of his way to respond to the neo-Kantians who use this exact term a lot, but I don't know what they use in the German.
Yeah, I wanted to say to that point too. I like where you're going with that because it also calls into calls into question some of the Kantian ideas about treating people as ends itself and acting as though it were true, right? Because here it looks like Nietzsche's he's almost done a Kantian critique to look at what would make something like that possible, right? Um, what social elements go into constructing things like what such an end would be for the person themselves or um, the like, right? Because it looks like what you're basically getting here is, to your point, not only the creation of conscience, but also the way that norms go into um, effectively creating people who will be responsible to perform those actions, but also the way in which their conscience will bear upon them. Almost like a superego, I guess.
So I out that Sittlichkeit is actually something that Hegel explicitly talks about. I posted
Okay.
the Wikipedia article.
Yeah, it's been ages since I read the Phenomenology of Spirit. Vaguely remember ethical life. Yeah, the second sphere constitutes Kantian morality. It's been too. I don't want to speculate on Hegel too much. But he does here. I mean, either way, we don't have to do this. We don't have to relate it to like Hume, Kant, or Hegel or whatever, because he makes it clear that autonomous and moral are mutually exclusive. That this development of a conscience or a morality are binding. Right? It's like the determination. Maybe ethics is better here, right? Maybe that's what he's trying to get at more, rather than like this modern use of what we might say moral, like a right way to do what is right to do, or wrong, or was right to do, or was wrong to do, implies like a certain causality, right? In the way that autonomous doesn't. Autonomous, like acting by itself, is what I read that as.
Yeah, I like that, especially with his point about because what you're getting at is what makes a man or what makes a person more so free, right? And he puts that in quotations. And I like that point because there's something about this kind of freedom in relation to responsibility and conscience that comes with the competency to promise, as he calls it. And so if you back up to just the very last sentence of the preceding section, right? Nietzsche closes out by saying that those norms that shape the person, um, for himself and his own conception of himself, that like a man entering into a promise, he could guarantee himself as a future. So we're seeing this point again about the way that promising plays into not only creating the future, but this point about guaranteeing yourself a future, right? So this is very, it's certainly self-involved, right? It's not like the person is going full altruism here when evoking some of those Kantian characteristics we discussed.
It kind of reminds me of Derrida's Two Futures as well, that he takes from Nietzsche in his book on Nietzsche, Spurs and Styles, where he talks about there's the predictable future, which is not the future because it's predicted, it affects us now, and then there's the unpredictable future, the future that comes unpredicted, right? Which I think ties in here as well. The promised future is in a way not the future. It's either wrong, or if it does happen, then it was already affecting you when you promised it. Which goes for all promises, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why he's making conscience so fundamental, because is whatever the future ends up being, whether it's the like you're saying, however it fits in those two distinctions. I think this point about conscience, which again sounds suspiciously like a superego to me, but the way that plays into how the person, at some level of volition, right, not autonomy, but like you're saying, the social ethics, right, the norms that are basically directing them. If that's your guarantee of freedom and everything, right, then the way that conscience produces your ability to direct however your future is going to unfold seems to be really critical here.
I think this is important for Deleuze as well, in Difference in Repetition, when he talks about bêtise, stupidity, right? It's kind of like he relates it to this like idea of forgetfulness, because in tossing aside this kind of Humerian custom, right, this habit or custom, because Hume doesn't think that there is a causality that we can find. He thinks that it's imposed, and so what people actually do is enter into customs, right? And so, but this mistake, this forgetfulness, this type of mistake or stupidity, in a way, bêtise is a very complicated word that's hard to translate as well, but we'll go with stupidity for now. Is a thing that has a force to it, right? That has force that makes certain things possible. It's in this mistake that we see an escape from a certain type of causality that Hume describes as custom or habit. Which is like stands in direct opposition to what Hegel is saying about freedom, right? When he talks about the absolute spirit or whatever, he thinks that by constantly entering into these type, it's not, this isn't a perfect analogy, but into something like these customs or habits, that these things will arise, these contradictions or these problems will arise that will be overcome, and then we'll be in like a new, better situation afterwards. This is like in direct opposition to that, where Nietzsche is like wanting to move away. He's wanting to cast aside these habits, and in order to like move forwards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that fits really well with this idea of honor, the very act of trusting, and I like this phrasing, the teeth of fate, right? So to your point about promising, but also the way it's basically appealing to the person being like a sovereign, or at least there being some indication of sovereign presence through this idea of responsibility, and also through conscience here, right? Because to your point, it sounds like this idea even about contradictions is I don't want to say it's simply self-serving, but it's socially serving, right? That's part of the way these relationships are functioning, as opposed to any reconciliation or any kind of disillusion with that, or I should say dissolving of that problem, if it is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, origin of responsibility is weird in the way I think Nietzsche is putting it here, is weirdly a tautology. Because origin implies responsibility, right? And responsibility implies origin. Because how can we be responsible for something that will happen if we don't think that there's an origin, right? Or it's kind of like two ways of looking at the same thing, right? To start from an origin is to put oneself in a grounding where one has a certain responsibility, like a promise, right?
Yeah, and this is where I can really see your point about Hume, because that all implicates having a conscience, right?
Well, I would avoid maybe he's more so making fun of Hume when he says conscience, because I don't think that Hume thought of it that way necessarily. But yeah.
Cool. Do we have any other thoughts on this section before we move into section 3?
I see Jan typing out something very long, presumably. Maybe getting ready to say I'm wrong about everything. No, okay.
Turns out it's all about Hamlet, right? Can't read
Yeah.
Shakespeare, or can't read Nietzsche without reading Shakespeare, yeah.
I guess. Links corruption to custom.
To relate this to Deleuze, with that is Nietzsche talking, correlating the custom and morality with common sense and good sense?
Are you talking about logic of sense now?
Right. Well, he introduced those terms in difference repetition, but I think he continues with it in logic of sense.
I thought logic of sense was older. Am I wrong?
Logical sense is after difference and repetition.
Is it? Interesting.
Yeah, it's after it's the long Spinoza book, not the short one.
Yes, it's the year after. For some reason, I thought it came out in '64. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I remember it in difference and repetition as well. Yeah. I think we don't even have to. We can go to Anti-Oedipus as well, right? That's the example that springs more to mind here of the tossing aside of origins, for instance, beginnings and ends, right?
So this idea of Nietzsche's idea of forgetfulness would be something like Deleuze's discussions about the event, right?
I think stupidity lines up really well in the French bêtise that he uses in difference and repetition.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the sovereign as well. He even uses similar language. If that rings a bell at all.
Yeah. Or schizophrenia.
Sorry, what was that?
Schizophrenia.
I mean, there's definitely a relation, right? Because like the schizophrenic process is like a type of thing that it is less concerned with a lot of the things that Nietzsche is talking about here, with things like custom, right? It is like a line of flight is like a thing that goes through beyond like this bounds of custom or habit in the way that Nietzsche put them here, right?
Right.
So I think that makes sense as well. Yeah. I'm sure there's like a lot of different relations we could go to. The double bind as well. I mean, I already used that language earlier to describe this thing, right? Where we're bound from both ends, but from the way in which we enter in from the beginning as like an origin, and then also what we expect to happen next, or what we are trying to guarantee happens next. Is that with the same stroke, we cut ourselves off on both ends.
The use of the word conscience at the end of this passage, is that for Nietzsche a positive term for him, or is he's taking
I think it's both, right? Like, I think this whole thing is both, because
Okay.
this is a certain way of going about things, right? Is
Mhm.
is to talk about an origin, and is to talk about an end, and is
Mhm.
to talk about things that will come next. And from this is where we get like a conscience, right? So on some level, he thinks that it's good. To relate it to like when he talks about slave morality, right? He thought that something was gained from slave morality, from the emergence of the Christian idea that we're sinful, like we got good at things like lying, right? He thinks, and being deceitful, and we gained a certain type of intelligence or canniness when we did that. But also, I think he views it as something that we should be getting ready to move past as well.
Mm.
So in a way, it's negative, right? But not in the way that we would want to forget the lessons of conscience, perhaps.
Mhm.
At least that's how I see it. I don't mean to be, the monolith or whatever.
I wanted to add to that too. The way that conscience seems to actually be mutually exclusive for autonomy. So there is some dubiousness here about that. And certainly to your point, I don't think it's a good or evil problem, right? But there is that, I think, that concern that as conscience and responsibility stand in this ethics, right, there does not seem to be autonomy, but this, I guess it'd be kind of at least a sort of false freedom or skepticism toward the freedom present here.
If we want, if we want to put it in terms of good and evil, I'll say that if Hegel is good, then everything Nietzsche is saying here is evil. Because I definitely think he's making fun of Hegel a lot when he compares, like, this direct comparison between autonomous and moral is literally him making fun of Hegel, right? Because Hegel thinks that from morality, from these customs or whatever, like, we'll reach the absolute spirit, where we're just like freedom to him. It's like the closest relation I could give in without spending hours explaining Hegel or whatever. And so when he says they're mutually exclusive, he's like, yeah, there's freedom, but Hegel doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah, and so this is where even with distribution goes in AO, right? You can kind of see how there's, with the blockages and the openings up, there is possibility for sort of schizophrenic connections, but also this paranoiac force that works with it, right? Because to your point, he will give Hegel that, yes, space opens up for possibilities, right? But it's not the space of autonomy. It's the space of dishonor, right? So you do have this kind of colliding of the two here, if you want to put it in like the second synthesis terms.
I don't. Do we want to move on to the next section? Does anybody else have anything they want to say? No. Okay. I'll read the next section. His conscience. One apprehends at once that the idea conscience, which is here seen in its supreme manifestation, supreme in fact, to almost the point of strangeness, should already have behind it a long history in evolution. The ability to guarantee oneself with all due pride, and also at the same time to say yes to oneself, that is, as has been said, a ripe fruit, but also a late fruit. How long must needs this fruit hang sour and bitter on the tree? And for an even longer period, there was not a glimpse of such a fruit to be had. No one had taken it on himself to promise it, although everything on the tree was quite ready for it, and everything was maturing for that very consummation. Quote, how is a memory to be made for the man animal? How is an impression to be so deeply fixed upon this ephemeral understanding, half dense and half silly, upon this incarnate forgetfulness, that it will be permanently present? End quote. As one may imagine, this primeval problem was not solved by exactly gentle answers and gentle means. Perhaps there is nothing more awful and more sinister in the early history of man than his system of mnemonics. Quote, something is burnt in so as to remain in his memory. Only that which never stops hurting remains in his memory, end quote. This is an axiom of the oldest, unfortunately also the longest, psychology in the world. It might even be said that wherever solemnity, seriousness, mystery, and gloomy colors are now found in the life of the men and the nations of the world, there is some survival of that horror which was once the universal concomitant of all promises, pledges, and obligations. The past. Oh, God. Sorry, I'm a little bit difficult at keeping track of this wide page. The past with all its length, depth, and hardness, wafts to us its breath and bubbles up in us again. When we become serious, when man thinks it necessary to make for himself a memory, he never accomplishes it without blood, tortures, and sacrifice. The most dreadful sacrifices and forfeitures, among them the sacrifice of the firstborn, the most loathsome mutilation, for instance, castration, the most cruel rituals of all the religious cults, for all religions, are already at bottom systems of cruelty. All these things originate from that instinct which found in pain its most potent mnemonic. In a certain sense, the whole of asceticism is to be ascribed to this. Certain ideas have got to be made inextinguishable, omnipresent, fixed, with the object of hypnotizing the whole nervous and intellectual system through these fixed ideas. And the ascetic methods and modes of life are the means of freeing those ideas from the competition of all other ideas, so as to make them unforgettable. The worse memory man had, the ghastlier the signs presented by his customs. The severity of the penal laws affords in particular a gauge of the man's difficulty in conquering forgetfulness and in keeping a few primal postulates of social intercourse ever present to the minds of those who were the slaves of every momentary emotion and every momentary desire. We Germans do certainly not regard ourselves as an especially cruel and hard-hearted nation, still less as an especially casual and happy-go-lucky one, but one has only to look at our old penal ordinances in order to realize what a lot of trouble it takes in the world to evolve a, quote, nation of thinkers, end quote. I mean, the European nation which exhibits at this very day the maximum reliability, seriousness, bad taste, and positiveness, which has, on the strength of these qualities, a right to train every kind of European mandarin. These Germans employ terrible means to make for themselves a memory, to enable them to master their rooted plebeian instincts and the brutal crudity of those instincts. Think of the old German punishments, for instance, stoning. As far back as the legend, the millstone falls on the head of the guilty man. Breaking on the wheel, the most original invention and speciality of the German genius in the sphere of punishment. Dart throwing, tearing or trampling by horses. Quartering, boiling the criminal in oil or wine, still prevalent in the 14th and 15th centuries. The highly popular slicing into strips, cutting the flesh of the breast. Think also of the evildoer being besmeared with honey and then exposed to the flies in the blazing sun. It was by the help of such images and precedents that man eventually kept in his memory 5 or 6 I will nots, with regard to which he had already given his promise, so as to be able to enjoy the advantages of society. And verily, with the help of this kind of memory, man eventually attained reason. Alas, reason, seriousness, mastery over the emotions, all these gloomy, dismal things, which
Now
are
recording.
reflection, all these privileges and pageantries of humanity, how dear is the price that they have exacted? How much blood and cruelty is the foundation of all good things. I think at the beginning here, when he's talking about the ability to guarantee oneself with all due pride, kind of like a promise and relating to the conscience, as he said in the previous sentence, and also at the same time to say yes to oneself. That is, as has been said, a ripe fruit, but also a late fruit. How long must needs the fruit hang sour and bitter on the tree? It almost is exactly what I was just saying about his attitudes towards conscience and morals, right? That a ripe fruit, like it was one that gave us something, it was ripe, but how long must this fruit sour and bitter on the tree, right? We're ready to move on from it.
Yeah, it's a scathed fruit, right? Because to get that fruit, you've got to go through. Well, you've got to get a conscience so as to have this point about responsibility, and so to get these fruits of a kind of self-affirmation in this system of ethics, right? It comes with this problem of cruelty.
Yes, I mean cruelty plays into it, right? Certainly, it's like one indelible part of it. And I think it's interesting. He kind of thinks that at that time, in the late 1800s or whatever, people back then, they didn't think that Germany was particularly cruel or hard-hearted or whatever, but neither casual or happy-go-lucky. I find this ever relevant today. When people say something like, "Oh, racism doesn't exist anymore," and it's like Nietzsche is like, people were even saying this. Something similar to that. At this time that Nietzsche was alive, and I mean, we all know what happened after that. So, in the decades after his death, twice.
That would be the Red Baron and Snoopy, right?
Sure.
But yeah, I think that's spot on what you're getting at too, because that's another. Again, we're getting into how conscience functions, right? So this idea about we are not hard-hearted nor are we light-hearted, right? It just so happens that conveniently connects with this point about the forgettable and that which is created through memory. So this point about marking bodies and the system of mnemonics plays into things that make possible convictions like you're talking about.
So he is associating the ripe fruit of humanity with with reason, right? Rational thinking, and that it depended on this whole history of the ascetic ideal and punishment and cruelty in order to achieve this ripe fruit of reason. Is that how you interpret it?
I mean, I think we could take it to reason, certainly. I mean, he definitely is begrudging of reason in a way and the subject. But I see it more as conscience. But I suppose that they're kind of interrelated. He seems to be talking more about like the self and reflection, right? He talks a few times about like man saying yes to himself, and he says dismal things which are called reflection. All these privileges and pageantries of humanity. I'm seeing a lot of psychoanalytic terms in here, like castration, and there was another big one I noticed. But Freud claims to have never read Nietzsche, right?
No, yeah, I think he said that at some point, but I think it's completely consensus that that's not true.
Right.
And like there are a few things in this. I think a bit later there is a bit where consciousness is very similar to what Freud would call the superego.
Well, and even this point about drives, right?
Yes. A lot of this here sounds a lot like Freud, although I think Nietzsche might be unhappy with what Freud said about those things. Perhaps. And I'm seeing a lot of Foucault here as well, like with the bringing up of these types of punishments used to enforce, to guarantee a certain type of trust in the king during the feudal period, and on his topic of like episteme, right? You have to go. Okay, good. Been good having you anyway.
Yeah, I think you're right there, and it's interesting too because Nietzsche, it's interesting he goes toward the I will nots, right? So it's interesting that we're seeing an obstruction that calls into question forgetfulness, but it also brings in this point about I've already promised, right? To which he has already given his promise not to do these things. So it's interesting. I kind of get the picture of like there being this social creation of norms in that, which effectively you're sort of implicated in, right? You've got that responsibility leading to conscience, and yet there still is this problem of cruelty to create selves that are going to work with that kind of obstruction, right? Are going to make that kind of promise with this point about will.
I feel like there's not much more for me to say because I said everything I wanted to say about this already. He says something interesting about this is an axiom of the oldest, unfortunately the longest psychology in the world. Yeah, the fact there's something more sinister in the early history of man than his system of mnemonics. Something is burnt in so as to remain in his memory. Only that which never stops hurting remains in his memory. But there's like a primordial malice, a prior to causality malice that has instated causality, right? Because this is the idea of the conscience or whatever, or the moral, is itself instated in these customs or habits where we're like inventing a type of causality, right? And yeah, it's like that Nietzsche is almost saying like this comes about from a malignancy, from a cruelty. So that's interesting too. Yes, suffering leads to a conscience, at least. Perhaps consciousness as well, like you say.
Yeah, I think in the third chapter in this book, he talks about the aesthetic ideal, which is similar, and that it shows in the history of religious practices and different forms of the ascetic ideal, and it's similar to this kind of cruelty. That this seems like the cruelty is inflicted by the society, and it becomes a superego, and it develops into the conscience. But yeah, the ascetic ideal, I think he talks about as a kind of a self-infliction of cruelty, of self-denial. more, but it's still a social, a kind of a social cootie also.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. That's a very astute point. I mean, he talks about the ascetics a lot, and maybe we'll talk about that more when we get there. But he's really talked about the ascetic methods and modes of life are the means of freeing those ideas from the competition of all other omnipresent, fixed with the knowledge of hypnotizing the whole nervous and intellectual system through these fixed ideas, right? So as to make them unforgettable, even. Perhaps this is in response to Schopenhauer as well, right? He would do very similar. He agreed with the ascetics. He thought that was like the one way to escape suffering was asceticism. And although I often read Nietzsche as being quite generous towards Schopenhauer, in this case, he's kind of disagreeing with him, right? In a way, where he's saying that you're actually just subjecting yourself to worse, or you're not escaping you're using the tool by which you stumbled upon suffering in order to try and escape it.
So would he say that Kant was the one who began the same kind of idea of conscience, but it's initiated by the individual. The individual takes over and causes the categorical imperative. It becomes his conscience.
I think Nietzsche maybe sees conscience as being a thing like of sin, like a Christian thing, before it's a Kantian thing. Or maybe I instead of saying Nietzsche thinks this, I say I will take it in this direction and say that it seems like more of a Christian thing of sin, being sinful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which wasn't really a thing to like the Greeks, which Nietzsche calls master morality, right? And he calls like the Christian mode like slave morality,
Right.
which he's even used the term. He's already referred to this idea as like who are the very slaves of every momentary emotion and every momentary desire, right? That sounds like the Christian worldview, Oh, I must not sin. I must not sin. I must not sin. The slave to every momentary emotion or every momentary desire. Oh, I can't lie. I can't be attracted to a man. That's sinful, right? Like there's a desire is something they're slave to in fear of it. But I'm interested in, maybe you could elaborate on what you mean by like this imposition of a categorical imperative.
Yeah, because you could say that kind of sin is taken over, with the establishment of the individual, will. The individual will takes over what used to be done by the society, and the individual will impose on himself the categorical imperative, and it becomes his conscience. And Nietzsche would probably say that that's what the ascetic ideal has been, where the individual takes over that job that used to be, done by the society around him.
Yeah, like you just in like the ancient Greek times or whatever. Yeah,
Right.
I agree up to a point where we start using Kantian terminology like categorical imperative, because I almost see this idea of sin arising from a pursuit of ataraxia in the Hellenistic era by the Stoics and people like that then kind of like goes bad, or not bad, it goes in a different direction when it encounters Christianity, right? And then this and then maybe this is what we can now do genealogy, right? This sets the necessary, maybe this is more archaeology, but anyway, this sets like the necessary groundwork, this sets the necessary conditions in the episteme for Kant to come up with his categorical imperative. But it was something that was already part of the social norm when he was talking about it, from like an older virtue ethics, right? Because there's something in being in striving for piety that is something similar to striving for virtue, right? For ataraxia. I'm thinking of a lecture by John Cobb on Whitehead's model and multiple spiritualities, where he talks about something like this, about how at a certain time there was a spiritual idea of wanting to be pious, of piety being very important, but then it was ruined by piousness. And so nowadays, we don't piety is not respected basically anywhere. Which perhaps maybe ties more into like the spoke Zarathustra, God is dead type thing. But even so, I think there's a relation here too, with regard to like the emergence of this type of ethics, or ethics in general, even. Because that's where I hesitate to talk about like the deontological categorical imperative, because Nietzsche wants to make this about conscience in general. And so there has to already be like the groundwork there, which I think is the essence of genealogy, right? So, if there can be an essence to such a thing.
I think you're spot on there, because that's the thing, right? I think conscience, to your point, does precede Christianity, because he's about to move into where we get bad conscience from, which is where you have the consciousness of sin. And I think you're spot on that virtue ethics plays into this, right? Because we're moving from language about the development of character, right? The way that honor or nobility plays into that. We're seeing how that's moving us into, well, first that's grounded in the system of cruelty, right? So to one of your earlier points too, like to have this fashioning of the memory already implicates this point about cruelty, right? So I think that's part of the reason he can say this is so ancient, right? Is as far as we're going to find cruelty, and so far as we're going to find memory, we're also going to find the necessity of the mnemotonets, right? So wherever you have one, you have the other, yeah. And so I really like your point too, that with the creation of something like virtue ethics, right, you do get into these problems, not only of conscience, right, but of basically how nobility sits in terms of responsibility, which is really important for Aristotle in the development of character, right? But also how it fits into the creation of conscience with that responsibility toward character, or as we're seeing here, toward the self.
Yeah. I mean, adding on to that as well. I mean, I feel like I'm jumping ahead here, but Nietzsche really doesn't like Socrates, and obviously this idea of virtue ethics and ataraxia is something inspired by Socrates, right? In people like Zeno and Epicurus and the skeptics, Pyrrho, among many others as well, of course. And he has a lot of animosity for Socrates, and he says like he's a bad philosopher because he's ugly and stuff like that, which is like implicitly it's like a spit in the face to Socrates, because Socrates died for truth over mere utility, right? Or died for truth over like this sophistic or whatever, like I'm arguing for something just because I want to. And so by Nietzsche saying Socrates is wrong because he's ugly, he's not only making fun of Socrates for being ugly, but he's also giving a response to his philosophy, right? Because he's making an aesthetic decision about truth.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, and it's interesting because in his early work, he says that it would be more correct to say we have pre-Platonic philosophers than pre-Socratics, right? So like even the birth of tragedy, he's trying to work out, seeing through Plato to Socrates as this something other than Platonic dialogues. So yeah, I think you're spot on there. There's at least the skepticism toward that, if not Socrates himself, that Platonic ideal of Socrates.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
So Nietzsche's making a kind of a criticism of Socrates by saying he's ugly. It's
Yes.
a kind of criticism of transcendental truth as opposed to empirical truth.
It's more so like Socrates would say, we don't simply go to truth because we like it more or whatever, right? We don't simply that's not philosophical, right? Or Plato at least would think of it as sophistic. To say,
Right.
they would say you can't just say that's better because it's more aesthetically pleasing. But then Nietzsche does that. He just says Socrates is a bad philosopher because he's ugly, which he was notoriously ugly, by the way. I should probably add that.
Right. In spite of his ugliness, he was also very attractive to his a lot of his cohorts.
Oh, perhaps for other reasons, yes. But he was supposedly physically very ugly.
Right.
Truth and beauty merge in Christian ideas of the good. Yes, that's a good point. That's kind of like a move away from master morality, right, to slave morality, perhaps. Anyway, we're approaching like the hour and a half mark. Do you want me to do one more and then?
You read my mind. Take us home.
Okay. But how is it that that other melancholy object, the consciousness of sin, the whole bad conscience, came into the world? And it is here that we turn back to our genealogists of morals. For the second time, I say, or have I not said it yet, that they are worth nothing. Just their own 5-span long, limited modern experience, no knowledge of the past and no wish to know it. Still less a historic instinct, a power of second sight, which is what is really required in this case. And despite this, to go in for the history of morals. It stands to reason that this must produce results which are removed from the truth by something more than a respectful distance. Have these current genealogists of morals ever allowed themselves to have even the vaguest notion, for instance, that the cardinal moral idea of ought originates from the very material idea of owe? Or that punishment developed as a retaliation absolutely independently of any preliminary hypothesis of the freedom or determination of the will? And this is to such an extent that a high degree of civilization was always first necessary for the animal man to begin to make those much more primitive distinctions of intentional, negligent, accidental, responsible, and their contraries, and apply them in the assessing of punishment. That idea, the wrongdoer deserves punishment because he must have acted otherwise, in spite of the fact that it is nowadays so cheap, obvious, natural, and inevitable, and that it has had to serve as an illustration of the way in which the sentiment of justice appeared on earth. It is, in point of fact, an exceedingly late and even refined form of human judgment and inference. The placing of this idea back at the beginning of the world is simply a clumsy violation of the principles of primitive psychology. Throughout the longest period of human history, punishment was never based on the responsibility of the evildoer for his action, and was consequently not based on the hypothesis that only the guilty should be punished. On the contrary, punishment was inflicted in those days for the same reason that parents punish their children even nowadays, out of anger at an injury that they have suffered, an anger which vents itself mechanically on the author of the injury. But this anger is kept in bounds and modified through the idea that every inquiry has somewhere or other its equivalent price and can really be paid off, even though be it by means of pain to the author. Whence is it that this ancient, deep-rooted, and now perhaps ineradicable idea has drawn its strength? This idea of an equivalency between injury and pain. I have already revealed its origin. in the contractual relationship between creditor and ower that is as old as the existence of legal rights at all, and in its turn points back to the primary forms of purchase, sale, barter, and trade. I again can't but help but feel like Nietszche is agreeing with me again. With this, wanting to push away, or the same revulsion that I had towards the imposing the categorical imperative back to the beginning, right? These genealogists of morals that he's complaining about is like the Kantians, right? it is the Kantians and people like this who are trying to make claims on, you know, ethical judgments going way back, like the categorical imperative, thinking that they were always there and that it was always about people of this idea of justice was always about people getting yes, eye for an eye, like getting equal back, right, to the detriment of them. And I think it's interesting that he even brings up this very modern idea of like disciplining your child not being productive either to the person doing it or the child.
Yeah, or just emotional acting, right? In that example, it's just simply that the child is annoying the hell out of the parent, right? And discipline comes with that. And to expand on your point about the Kantians in that, right? So this is your mnemotenets, right? This is the way Nietszche is talking about trying to locate what's obstructed and looking at the memory that's being fashioned with everybody, right? And in this case, it happens to correspond, if not to the categorical imperative, but creating a noble origin, right? Yeah, mnemonics. I thought he says mnemotechnics. But yeah,
Mnemonics.
is it mnemonics?
Yeah, like a memory relating to memory.
I thought he was trying to do like the technology of that, but
Oh,
maybe I'm imposing my own terminology there. So thank you. But yeah, the way that memory is fashioned more directly. So we actually it's kind of cool how in this one he's working out how the genealogists themselves may actually be beguiled by this.
I think. Oh, maybe I don't want to go into Derrida actually. I was just going to say that there is like this longing for a universal, right? So of course the people doing this study of morals are going to want to find like a universal moral or some superior system, and if not Kant himself, then the people like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Kant, has this idea that the moral law, category imperative, originates from the goodwill, and so Nietzsche is saying that maybe not that it doesn't originate from the goodwill, but it just goes back even to the basic idea of an eye for an eye, right? It's based on what you interest someone, then you owe, and that person owes something back to you, and but you can't presume that that's based on a goodwill. It's just based on an eye for an eye, or some notion of vengeance, right?
I mean, I'm gonna do something gross to history here. I'm gonna mangle up history real bad, and I'm gonna say, look, recently, the consensus, right, is that beating your child or your dog or disciplining your dog is bad because they don't learn like what they did was wrong. They don't learn like how to stop doing the thing. What they learn to do often is get better at avoiding it, right? Now I'm going to take this understanding. I'm going to go way back to the 4th century AD, and I'm going to say that when Christianity was starting to emerge, this slave morality that Nietzsche is talking about is exactly this, right? This idea of being sinful, of being seen as doing wronghood, actually led to people being more. It didn't lead to people being more moral. What it did is it made people better at lying, better at tricking people, better at being deceitful, conniving. It made them in a certain way more intelligent. And I do this mutilation of history with in all good faith. I do not despise this motion that I am doing. History needed this in much the same way that the child didn't need the punishment. And I mean, there had to be some conditions for this idea surrounding, why we shouldn't be disciplining our children in this way to come about in the first place. So it's actually much older than the studies I'm talking about anyway, right? It's not like they found out about it. The reason that they thought to test it is because of some prior understanding that, Nietzsche definitely could have known about. But that's the thing that has the most relevance in my life personally. And so I'm going to very rudely and arrogantly impose it on the text.
Well, one thing you can do to support your rude and arrogant interpretation, if it is that, there are a couple of things that are consistent there, right? One of which is calculation, right? So how does discipline change when you can't physically mark a body, right? And so this is something that like Deleuze and Guattari will take up too. But there's a point about how discipline's changing, right? And we'll get things like shame, among others. But also to your point too, we have calculation, we have discipline, and we still have the point about necessity, right? We could give a Nietzschean squint to your point too, and say there's something that remains necessary here, right? Which is still this establishment of memory and obstruction through forgetting, right? There's still this problem of sort of not just constructing, but also living out the conscience. And here we're getting into how it's not just conscience anymore, it's bad conscience, right? So now you've got the introduction of sin.
All right, so the last few lines where he talks about creditor and ower, and the idea of purchase, sale, different forms of purchase, sale, barter, and trade, right? This kind of transactional relationship relates directly to the book we're reading, Anti-Oedipus, right? And the notion of flows and machines and so forth. I came in late, so I just trying to. Is this why we're reading Nietzsche?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, because we're going to relate it to the Anti-Oedipus.
I think we're using it as a grounding for the next section of Anti-Oedipus specifically.
So Nietzsche's saying that at the at the most primitive level, this kind of creditor and debtor, creditor and ower relationship is right there, right?
Yeah, and he's saying that this gave the ground for ought, for a moral idea of ought. What one owes is like a thing that comes before that determines what must be done now, and what one ought to do is like the other way around, right? It's like a promise. It's like an origin and a promise again, as well, relating it back to those first two sections.
Yeah, and we can connect this even going still with the Greeks to a point, right? Because we're talking about duty or Dion right now. So, and he's about to go into the Romans, but to that point too, one of the things I really like about this is his point that it's So we were talking about like the eye for the eye, punishment fits the crime. But I like Nietzsche's point that this is also negotiable, right? So there's bargaining possible. There's actually purchasing possible, right? Which is really interesting, right? So you can acquire things this way as well as sell things this way, and you can trade. So one of the things that sticks out to me here is this point about the price, right? So it doesn't have to be an eye for an eye. It just has to be, at least as I read it, the punishment
Something.
has to be proper compensation, right?
Hmm.
So as long as the price, I don't want to banalize it, but as long as the price is right for the parties, that's what makes the contract flow, right? So it doesn't have to be the eye matching the eye. It could be the eye for the foot, right? And you kind of have a surplus. You could have a surplus created or something else.
I
I'd
think
like
I
that
actually
to.
disagree,
Ooh, tell me more.
because compensation makes it sound like something's being done, right? And this is like what anarchists would say, about resolving these kind of problems. People are like, oh, what are you going to do about people who break the law? And the answer is often, well, we're going to try and put things back. We're going to try and make it so everybody can continue in a way that's productive, right? As opposed to punishing. And I think what Nietzsche is actually calling out here is the opposite of that, where nothing is actually being done as compensation. There isn't a compensation. There is a punishment, right? You are seen to pay, but it doesn't matter that anybody gets to cash out on your payment, just that you paid.
The big thing I like in your critique, I think you're right. If I'm suggesting that it's restorative, then yeah, I might be
Okay,
wrong there.
maybe I was assuming that too quickly, but yeah.
No, it's a fair point though, right? Because if I'm selling you something, I'm not restoring you to a position, right? If you're buying something from me, you're not being restored to a position necessarily. So, and that's the point that I like about the price, is it raises these questions of exactly how it's not exactly a market. I wouldn't go that far, but how these kind of contractual relations and how basically buying and selling, right, through credit and debt become possible.
I think that's related. I think it certainly is related, but the what he's talking about here with punishment and the relation between the parent and the child is a step away from that, because when you sell something, both parties, you're selling something and somebody else is buying it. But in the case of the parent and child, or the punishment, it's there's only one party, right? The one who does the punishing. The child or whatever, or the person being punished, isn't selling anything, but they're made to pay. Like, they're not buying anything either, but they're made to pay anyway.
Yeah, and I think that helps push it toward his point about rights. So this is where it's interesting. He's talking about rights, and then he's going to say, kind of primarily, there's this point about not just sales but barter and trade, because it almost sounds like he's suggesting with the parent and the child there might be a kind of trade going on, which unfortunately he's not going to qualify as such, right? But it's going to be the sensation of satisfaction, right? So the price works in relation to that, where at least as I'm reading it, a trade would be possible. But I like your point too. We shouldn't, because I don't want to make it into a market problem either.
I think it comes from that idea, certainly. And you bringing up rights really annoys me, because now I realize I haven't said anything about John Locke this entire time.
And you missed the
I
tabula
should have.
rasa and everything, man.
I know, I did. It's because I don't associate the tabula rasa with John Locke for whatever reason. That's what I get for taking Philosophy 101 and doing the same thing I criticized here, of like instantiating it as a universal, right? The tabula rasa was just thing people always talked about. Like, there definitely wasn't a guy that just made it up.
Yeah, because so there's and again you're back at like deontology in a sense, but we could also walk in utilitarianism in the way like calculation and like the tabula rasa play into that side of ethics, which I think he implicates in his preface. I could be wrong there. I thought he goes into like the whole problem of utility calculation.
Sorry, I'm just sending a dumb tweet about Nietzsche being an anarchist.
You're not going to do the acceleration this bit?
No, I'm saving that.
Rainy day. Go ahead, JK.
Yeah, so he's, Nietzsche's the one that's putting it into economic terms, right? So
Yeah.
Is that basically what Maynard Keynesian theory is all about, right? And that's that's what's in Anti-Oedipus, isn't it? The Keynesian theory of economics.
Yeah, so you get the expansion of what Nietzsche's talking. And this is what I mean. I don't want to over marketize it, but it is there, right? So this point about like all of a sudden we have credit and debt becoming blocks, right? So almost like assets or I don't want to say physical things, but almost like things that you can just kind of swap
Yeah.
and that circulate.
Yeah.
So webcam, I know you're a little bit more up on like the social contract and like Rousseau. That touched on like the social contract and that precedes Nietzsche, right? Because when he refers to
Yeah, I hope you're not implying Rousseau as a social contract dude either.
fair, yeah, I might be doing that.
You mean Hobbes and Locke? And there's somebody even more social contracty than them, but I don't remember who.
I was thinking Rousseau because I thought, doesn't he have an argument with Voltaire? So this is my line of thought. He has the argument with Voltaire on it, and I think it's Untimely Meditations is actually dedicated to Voltaire. So that's what led me to that thought. But I agree with you. Rousseau is not like the progenitor of it.
Well, I sort of maybe I have a weird reading of Rousseau, but I always read him as being against this idea of a social contract, even. Because he always appeals to nature rather than civilization, right? So it's like it's almost not a social contract because there's no contract. But anyway,
That's interesting.
maybe I'm doing like, I don't know, maybe it's too subtle of a difference to be talking about here, but like the Marxian value theory versus labor theory of value distinction.
From contractual relations to exchange relations, right? To labor relations. But
Yes.
as the jokes get worse, yeah, that's when you know it might be getting to the 2-hour mark. So I'll leave it to you guys. Do you have any final thoughts as we start to move into closing, so as to avoid bad stand-up comedy?
No, I think in honor of Nietzsche, we shouldn't have a conclusion. Everything was a conclusion.
Yeah, I like that.
None of it was a promise of a conclusion. It was all conclusive.
Yeah, the next section is about contractual relations.
Mm.
So
I'm gonna. Agamben is very big here as well, especially relating to the Roman stuff. But sorry, go ahead.
so we're not okay. I guess we don't have time to go into that. Maybe next week. Huh?
I think that was the plan. We've been going for a good 2 hours now, so.
Okay. Yeah, it's a pretty long session.
Yeah, but an enjoyable one too. And so I can't guarantee that we're going to do this book. I believe we're going back to Anti-Oedipus next week. But if we want to continue meeting for Genealogy of Morals, and it's a short test, right? I think we're like a third of the way through it already. Well, probably more like a quarter. I'm being too generous there, but yeah, if we want to keep reading this, we can do that. Is there interest in continuing this reading, or do you guys just kind of want to go do something else? Back to Anti-Oedipus as always. How do you feel?
Whatever people want.
Yeah, I think this last section gave me, the recognition that how Nietzsche relates to Anti-Oedipus. I don't know if there's more to say about finding other relationships between Nietzsche and Deleuze, Anti-Oedipus. I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll put a, well, first of all, thank you for that. We can say we achieved something today, and so Brooks will look kindly upon us like Zeus, right? But I'll post a poll, and if you guys are interested in doing a few more pop-up sessions or something of that nature with the genealogy of morals, we can work it out from there. That seem fair?
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Ha! Well played. Alrighty then, I will close the Craigbot, and thank you all for joining us for our June 15th session of, in lieu of an Anti-Oedipus reading, a reading of the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals.
Does anybody have the full recording? Because I know Craig got owned.
So Brooks is streaming right now on YouTube, which means a full recording does exist and is possible. But yes, there are some Craig cuttings.
May I have the Brooks recording and or link? If he's streaming, I can just pull it from the live stream.
As
Just make
Zach
it
say,
permanent. Is there a link to that somewhere?
let me see. I just sent him the Craig ones. Let me see what I can find on YouTube. Yep, I'm sending it to you right now. And actually, everything we're saying is probably included on that.
Yes.
Yep, and we are still being recorded, so I might have to move Brooks back to Mount Olympus.
Oh, is he not actually here?
Alrighty then, my friend. I've got to get ready for a meeting, so I really enjoyed talking with you as always, and I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, it was nice speaking to you as well.
Just realized I haven't talked to you in a few weeks, so it's been a minute.
It's because I hate the part of Anti-Oedipus where I think it's really boring.
Watch man on our recording.
Yeah, I've read it 3 times before. I'm like, I'll skip it this time.
Yeah, I get that, man. The big thing is with all these reading groups, participate where you where you enjoy it,
Yeah, if it was my first time reading it, then I probably would still. I'm not going to skip anything, obviously.